Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon on ditching Dewey. I'm Jamie Machik with the Nicolet Federated Library System located in Green Bay, and I'm happy that all of you are here to listen to this presentation. And this presentation is being given by Jessica Summer, and Jessica is the Youth Services Librarian at the Winooski, I think I said that right, Memorial Library in Winooski, Vermont. And if you don't know where Winooski is, I actually had to look on a map. It's in the northern part of Vermont, fairly close to the Canadian border, and Jessica said they're about 2 hours south of Montreal. So they have implemented using these genre systems for about a year and a half, and this is the first full year that they've been putting these systems into effect. So Jessica was kind enough to talk about how they did this at her library. So Jessica, whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Hi guys, thanks for coming today. Yeah. Okay. So part of the reason why we switched our system is because we regularly get questions like this. I'm sure it sounds familiar to many of you. Children coming in and saying, where are the truck books? I want a kitty book, or a parent looking for potty training books, or a kid wanting to learn about snakes or a specific holiday. And the problem with that is that all of these books are in many different places in the library, and these people are coming in and wanting to go one spot to find what they're looking for. Children are sometimes afraid to ask for help when they're in the library. Parents can get frustrated when they have to look in many different places. As an almost universal rule, all of our requests for books in our library are based on topic and not by an author. So people are frustrated when they have to use the author's last name to find a specific book. And in our community, we have a very high population of English language learners, so the language barrier makes it hard for a lot of those people to talk to us and can make it more intimidating. So one of the libraries that we worked with in Vermont did a survey of their children and asked their children what their experience in the library was like. And they told us that they have to ask a teacher for help to find things, and that they're sad when they have trouble finding something, and that they're not sure where to look for books. So we decided that we were going to change things up. So we asked, have you ever looked for a book in the library that you were unable to find? And 93% of the children said yes, which is a huge problem. So it's a catalog nightmare when kids are looking for something based on a specific subject or topic. Princesses is one of our most common requests, and this is an example of what the school catalog looked like before we changed things up. They were all over the place in many different places, and kids didn't know where to look for them. But there is a better way. So the school uses a slightly different system from our library, but this presentation is going to cover 3 different systems and then hybrids, which is what we have adopted in our library, as well as how to go about making these changes. So the first system is the METIS system. So the METIS system was created by school librarians in New York. It has 26 categories that are all arranged by topic. And it's different from the Dewey system because fiction, nonfiction, and picture books are all intershelved together. So this is a list of all the different categories that are in the METIS system, and each one is given a letter of the alphabet, and they are shelved in alphabetical order. So like all the A books come first, and then the B books, and then the C books. And so this is some of the signage that they have. Each category is assigned a letter, and the categories were assigned letters to flow in a specific order so that it makes sense to move from one topic to the next. Each category is divided into subcategories, and those subcategories are shelved in alphabetical order within each lettered section. And there's no author listed on the spine. It's just subject information. So this is an example of what a spine label would look like. Each category has its own graphic designed sticker, and you can order these. The main topic would be the top line. So in this example for machines, it would say B machines, and then underneath it, if it was a book about cars, it would say cars. If it was a book about trucks, it would say trucks. And the car books would come on the shelf before the truck books. But that way, a child who's looking for a book on trains knows exactly where to look in the machines section under trains. And this is what the catalog then would look like. The call number, instead of being the author's last name or the Dewey Decimal number, would say the letter category, so in this case B, and then the subcategory truck, so that you would know where exactly on the shelf to go find that. If you have any additional questions on the process of switching to the Meta system or the cost for the Meta system, the librarian we worked with is Nancy Daigle, and she works at the Thatcher Brook Primary School, and so this is her contact information. Another choice you have is Dewey Lite. This was pioneered by the Darien Public Library in Darien, Connecticut, and this is the system that most people are familiar with when we're talking about ditching Dewey. They used it in their Birth to 5 section of the library, and so all the books were for very young children. They broke it out into 10 categories, and they also made sure to include the parenting books for their adult users. And this is a color-coded system on the spine to make it easier for people to find what they're looking for. So these are the 10 categories that Darien uses. They have celebrations, rhymes and songs, concepts, favorites, and the favorite section is where you would find things like Clifford, or any of the Caldecott Award winners, or Fancy Nancy, or Mo Willems, or Dr. Seuss, or any of those things that often have series or are books that children request on a very regular basis. And that section would look different for each library depending on what their patrons would be looking for in that section. And it would change over time. They also have transportation, folk and fairy tales, growing up, which is where you'd find like potty training books and new siblings and things like that. Stories, which is everything that didn't fit somewhere else. Nature, and the learning to read books, so your easy readers. In this system, fiction and nonfiction books are shelved together within each category. Picture books are labeled with the first letter of the author's last name on a color-coded sticker. The nonfiction books were labeled with the normal Dewey numbers and were shelved at the end of the section. So you would go A to Z by author's last name for your fiction books, and then at the end in Dewey order for your nonfiction books. And these were shelved in alphabetical order, so you knew exactly where to find each book on the shelf, which made it an easier system for librarians to use, but was still family-friendly for the kids. The next section or system that you could use is the BISAC system. This is the Book Industry Standards system, and it's used by bookstores and publishers. So you will probably find the information for BISAC listed in your book ordering from Baker & Taylor or Ingram or any other major book distributor. This information is already listed in there if you wanted to look at it. They have 52 major sections by topic, and it's searchable in bibliographic databases, so you don't have to create this information for yourself. Because there are 50 different categories, I'm not going to read them all for you, but this is a list of all of them. Much like the Meta system, each one is broken down further into smaller sections. So for an example here, I put the crafts and hobbies section, and it's got smaller subcategories, and depending on your library's needs, you can make that as specific or non-specific as you would need to. Categories are shelved alphabetically by the category title, and the subcategories are in alphabetical order within each section. The one exception to this is history. History books are shelved in chronological order from the beginning of time to present. And some of the spines include the author's last name for ease in finding specific titles. So this is an example of what the catalog record looks like in the BISAC system. And we shelve all of our nonfiction books in our library for adults in the BISAC section. So if you have questions about specifically using the BISAC system or transitioning just to BISAC, you can contact our library director. Her name is Amanda Perry, and her contact information is here on the slide. So your final option is a hybrid. Personalizing a system will allow you to create something that works perfectly for your library needs and your community. In the process of creating a personalized system, it's important to keep your population in mind to make sure that whatever you're picking is something that addresses your individual population's needs. It's totally okay to pick bits and pieces of different systems and blend them together into something that meets your needs. When you're making changes to any system in your library, it's extremely important to make sure that you make very clear signs and post them everywhere, because it will help your staff and it will help your patrons understand how to find new materials and where they're going to be located. And we've found that spine genre labels are especially helpful in easing that transition. And so we have pictures here of some of the spine labels that we use. So now for our story of our library in transition. Before you begin, it's important to do your research, to think about the space you have to work with, and to understand your library's whys. For us, I did a lot of reading about different systems that were available and took lots and lots of notes about how each of the systems worked and what kinds of places were using them. The meta system, for example, is common in school libraries, but is extremely rare in public libraries. I think because the stickers can be more expensive and could be cost prohibitive to very small libraries. More and more libraries are adopting bookstore models similar to the Dewey Light system in Darien, Connecticut. So that's pretty common now in smaller public libraries. And the BISAC system works much like you would find in a bookstore. So it's familiar for a lot of places, for a lot of people who use bookstores for their primary source of books, which is true in our community. And it's also important to think about your space. Our library is very small. It's about 2,000 square feet, and it's a rectangular box. So we have no separate rooms for adults or programs or children. It's just a long tunnel. We don't even have walled-off office space. So we had to be careful in what we had for furniture and how much shelving space we had and the ability to move things around. So we planned our system based on the available shelf space we had and the small bookshelves that we had for the children's area. And it's also important when you're making changes to think about why you'd be making those changes. For us, we got a lot of requests for information on topical bases, or we had people who would come in and say that the library was really hard to use because they were used to going to the bookstore and they couldn't find anything in our space because libraries and bookstores use different systems, and it just didn't make sense to them. Our school library, until very recently, did not have a functioning cataloging system, so it was impossible to find books at the school either. So we were lucky in being able to make this transition without confusing students because the school library collection didn't have a real order. Once you understand why you're doing this and you've thought about what your space needs look like and how you're going to start, the first step is to weed and be ruthless, because every book you get rid of is one less book that you have to change the catalog record for in your system, and is one less book that you have to replace stickers for on the spines. We weeded out about 15% of our picture books, almost all of which were damaged and old. And it was just really great to be able to start fresh and know that we had a solid collection. Make a plan for where you want to start and how you're going to go through the process of making this change. For us, we started with the picture book section and gradually added new sections of the library as we went. And recruit volunteers or prepare your staff for the change. We used some volunteer time to help us with the stickers, and Amanda and I changed the catalog records in the system by ourselves. But it's very important that any regular volunteers you have in your library or any staff you have in your library are on board with the change and understand what you're doing so that they can put books away in the right spots when you make the change and that they can help explain it to your patrons. So this is our whys. Our patrons were really desperate for a bookstore model because it made more sense to them. In our space, because it's so small, we don't have a dedicated catalog computer, and we only have 2 computers that patrons have access to, and they're almost always in use. So it was really hard for people to find books on their own without asking for help. And our children were very frustrated with where our books were and how they were placed in order, because they weren't familiar with the Dewey system and had no exposure to it at school. And for us, most of our patrons tend to browse rather than look for a specific title, which is part of the reason why a bookstore model is so appealing to them. And we also wanted to make a system with categories that reflected the needs of our users, because not all the systems that we had found had categories that we felt met those needs. So our library collection is about 14,000 volumes. We have a small staff. We only have 1 full-time person, which is our director. I work just shy of 3/4 time, and then we have a just shy of half-time library clerk. We have around 3,500 registered patrons, and our community is about 7,500 people, and our city is very small. It's 1.43 square miles. And our annual budget is $153,000. So we don't have a ton of space, and we don't have a ton of money, but we were trying to do the best we could to meet the needs of our community. So we started with the picture book section. I decided to adapt the Dewey Light system for our picture books. And so the categories that we have are the All About Me section, bedtime, celebrations, concept books, fairy tales, fables, songs and rhymes, favorites, nature, stories, and transportation. And these are color-coded because I use color stickers on the spines. And the All About Me section, we came back to and revisited and further broke down into smaller categories based on how people were asking for the books. So we have an All About Me section that is specific to all the things that a baby or toddler or preschooler could do. Books on new siblings, books on community, so that's where like books about different careers would go, or what it's like to live in villages in other countries. First experiences is like going to the doctor for the first time. Family books are all the books about different family members. Feelings is where we would put all the books on different emotions that young children would be struggling with. All the books on friendship are together. We have a few on manners, and this is where books would go that talk about how to be a good friend to someone or how to behave in school. We have a section for pets, which also includes books on how to take care of pets. We have a few on potty training, although we have learned that they're impossible to keep on the shelf because it is our most popular section in the picture book section. And we have lots of books on getting ready to go to school. And so this is what a catalog record would look like for us. In the location, it says that it's on the picture bookshelf. So all of these books are together on one S-shaped bookshelf, and each bay is a different category. And we have some of the small ones are on the top of the shelf in between thematic bookends. So this transportation is one of the ones that we have in between 2 bookends that have trains on them. So it's very obvious that all the transportation books are together. The transition process took us about 2 days of sorting the books, labeling them, and changing the catalog records for all the picture books that were physically in the library. It took me about 4 months to process all the returned picture books as they were returned to us. And we kept the library open and serving patrons during the transition, and I was the only staff member in the library while we did that. And we had 1 volunteer who donated 6 hours of their time to make this happen. So we had discussed that this was coming, and I was planning to start it in the fall. And my director came into work one day and told me that we had a surprise volunteer, that we needed to come up with a project for him, and that we were going to start this project the next day. So that's what we did, and I sorted through and pulled out every book and hand-inspected each one and decided where I wanted to put each book. The cost for us to do this was very low. We spent $53 on colored labels. Most of the colors are only $5 for a box of 500. And we bought extras because sometimes Demco retires their library colors and picks new ones for their stickers, and we wanted to make sure that we had enough forever. So we bought extras while we did it. We printed spine labels, and it cost us about $35 for a box of 10,000. So we can print new labels for every book in the library and still not run out of one box. So it's super affordable. And it took me about 20 hours of staff time to sort through all the books and relabel all the records. So this is a picture of our library in the before. This is when I first started, and our picture books were in these horrible record bins from the 1970s, and the drawers would stick, and when babies would pull up on them, they would fall over, and the drawer faces would hit them in the face, and babies would cry, and their fingers would get pinched, and it was just terrible. So we got this beautiful new shelf, and we have pictures of the entire picture book collection sorted by topic on furniture and the floor and chairs. And by the first day, I had pulled out our favorites section. And this is what it looked like at the beginning of our second day. And this was all during summer reading, so programming was happening at the same time. And this is what it looked like when we were done at the end of day 2. This top picture is what our transportation section looked like, so you can see what I meant by our themed bookends. Our Learning to Read collection, we put the Step Into Reading books in this small round spinner that we got from the school. We traded them those awful record bins because they really wanted them, and we got this great spinner. And then our Read spinners have our chapter books. So these are the beginning chapter books, like Nancy Clancy and Mercy Watson and Magic Tree House. Those books that are really in between stepping into reading and more advanced books. We put them all together to make it easier for children to find. And they're all series, and they're shelved by series title. So all the books in our picture book section are appropriate for children from birth to 5, and they're all given a spine label that says P for picture book plus the first letter of the author's last name, and this is printed on a colored dot to signify the category. Nonfiction and picture books are filed together, and they all have the same type of call number, which is PO for a Fancy Nancy book, for example. We had to go back and break down the All About Me section to make it easier for parents. So it's important when you're making this transition and adapting a system to listen to the feedback that you're getting from people who are using it, because you might find that you need to make some changes, and that's totally okay. So now moving on to the youth collection. The most frequent requests in our youth section are for sports, fantasy, and, quote, real stories. Our nonfiction had very low circulation, was sometimes a challenge for kids to reach all the shelves. And we were constrained by shelf space that we had for the number of different categories possible, but we knew we needed to make a change to make our youth books more accessible to the people in our library. So we adapted a little bit from the Dewey Light system and a little bit from the Meta system to come up with the following categories for our youth system. We have realistic fiction, cultures and traditions, and that's where you'd find books on foreign countries, any holidays, all those sorts of things. Adventure, primarily fiction books, but also has biographies and nonfiction about people like Amelia Earhart. Scary books, Ourselves and Our Community, which are books about our bodies and how to find jobs and how to interact in the community, and books on manners and that sort of thing. History, science, mystery, humor, science fiction, fantasy together, because that's how people in our library request those materials, but if that's different for your community, it's totally fine to separate those. Historical fiction, making stuff, which is where all your craft books and game books and things like that would go. Animals, which is both fiction and nonfiction. Sports, and then series books. and these are the labels that we use. The multicultural label is the one that I use for cultures and traditions, and the other ones I made using that box of 10,000 labels, and I just printed out the subject names and took a marker and colored them to make different stickers. So if you can't find what you want pre-made by Demco or whatever other book vendor you're using, make your own. It's super cheap and really easy, and it's a great volunteer thing to give to a volunteer. This is an example of our catalog records. So this is what both a fiction and a nonfiction book would look like within the animal section. Under location it says youth, so that people know that it's the back wall by the water fountain or to the left of the water fountain. And in the collection it's animals. So people know to look for that animal sticker. And they're all together on one shelf. The transition process for the youth collection was a little bit different. It took me 2 days of sorting the nonfiction and the youth fiction books into the different categories. It took me 3 weeks to change all the catalog records and to make and apply all the new spine labels. And it took me about 2 months to decide where each section was going to live for good on the shelves. There's a lot of shifting and changing my mind and moving things around that happened during that time. And the project was completed during library hours. The genre stickers for these, because there's more different subjects, were a little bit more expensive. It cost us about $100 to buy all of them. We used the same spine labels from before, and it took me about 45 hours of staff time to manage all of that. You definitely want to embrace the mess. This is not a neat project. It is easier to do it by taking everything off the shelves and sorting through it. This is what it looked like the first day as I was starting to sort through our nonfiction books and decide which categories our nonfiction was going to wind up in. But by the end of the second day, everything was back on the shelf and it looked like new. So as you can see on the left-hand side of the bookshelf it says Read, Play, Dream, and Grow. The whole left side bay is realistic fiction, but then for the rest of it, each shelf is a different category. And you can see that from the spine labels on the different books. And then because our largest collection was science fiction and fantasy, we put all of those together on the small shelf. So that was the least popular place to find things, and we knew people would still use that collection if we put it there. So we combined pieces of Dewey, Light, and Metis to create a system that really worked for our population. I invented some of my own categories as I went through the collection to find ways to put away the materials that we had in ways that our patrons would find them. And we chose to file biographies within each section rather than pull them all out together for several reasons. Many of our students are required as a part of their school to write book reports on biographies, but they refused to read anything that was in the biography section. Most of the time when they're assigned this project, they don't want to find things on their own and tell us how much they don't like reading biographies. So we try to get them excited about their project by asking them what subjects they're interested in school, and we thought that by filing the biographies by subject instead of all together as a biography, that people would be more likely to read them, and the circulation on them has gone way up for that reason. And the whole change has helped to increase our nonfiction circulation. The last step was tackling the adult collection. Our patrons have been asking for fiction by topic from the beginning, and it's the most heavily browsed section of our library. We decided to adopt a more traditional bookstore model for our fiction books, and the categories we have are mystery, science fiction, fantasy, romance, and general fiction. So this is a picture of the spine labels that we have. We put our classics in with the regular fiction, as well as the historical fiction. They're within the regular fiction as well, because we don't have very many of them. Each book kept its regular spine label. We just added genre labels so that people would know how to find them on the shelf. And it took us about a week to label and move all the books and update the catalog record. our nonfiction system, we use BISAC. The BISAC data is available for each book from our book jobber, but you can tweak it and make your final decision on where each book ends up, which we've done some of in our collection based on how our patrons would be looking for a specific topic. It's much easier for patrons to browse the collection this way. It's especially helpful if patrons are looking for information that they might be embarrassed to talk to you about. Our self-help books is a great example of that. A lot of people didn't feel comfortable telling us that that's what they were looking for, and now they don't have to tell us. They know exactly where they are. Wherever possible, we add genre labels for consistency across our collection. So we have similar stickers for all the different age groups if it's a topic that goes across all the age groups. The switching to the BISAC in particular was a very long transition process. It took us about a year to change all the catalog records and process all the books in our space. All of our transition work was done during library hours and around other necessary tasks. So we didn't close, we didn't come in on days that we weren't usually there or days that the library wasn't open to get any of this work done. We did it around other programming needs and other library needs. So anybody can do it. The cost for the fiction spine labels for the adult section was about $35. The nonfiction spine labels were about $29. We just bought Avery labels and print them out that way. And the genre labels are $7.55. What we learned is that it's very important to be flexible and to listen to your patrons. What makes sense to you as a librarian might not make sense to the people who are actually using the collection. And when in doubt, it's more important to make sure that your patrons can find the material because that's why we're there. Signs, signs, and more signs. Signage is the most important thing you can do in this transition process because that makes it easier for everyone to find what they're looking for, including the staff who might not have been involved in making the change. We also learned how important it was to embrace the mess. It's not a neat process, especially if you're trying to do it quickly like we did in the youth collections, but it's totally worth it. It's also a great opportunity to get some serious weeding done. And an unexpected perk for me was that I got to order a ton of new books. This process will make sure that you know what the holes are in your collection. And it's important before you start this process to make sure you have a little wiggle room in your book budget to be able to buy things to fill in those holes as you find them. So these are some pictures of some of the signs we have in the children's area. We made a favorite characters sign with pictures of many of the favorite characters that our children are reading about. So even kids who can't read yet know exactly where to find the books that they're looking for. We have color-coded signs that are labeled for our picture book sections, like this favorite signs that explains what's in each topic. We made signs with more pictures for the top of our series spinners, and we have one that is all graphic novels. So we put all the pictures from the graphic novels there. And so kids know which titles are where and how to find them. And each hole on the spinner is labeled with a popsicle stick that we attached with Velcro that says what series is in that spot on the spinner. It's important to be flexible. The picture here on the left is what it looks like now that I have broken down the growing up section or the all about me section into more topics that make it easier for families to find what they're looking for. The orange stickers on the shelf have the different labels of the subcategory in that section, and then I wrote it right on the shelf. And while it looks like I wrote on the actual piece of furniture, I cheated. That is white painter's tape, so it won't leave any permanent residue on the shelf, and if I decide to change the system later, I can always take it off and put new paint on, or new tape on, and it won't damage the shelf at all. And we used to have all of our leveled readers in a different kind of space, and we had too many of them, and it was becoming a problem. So we sorted them into these different bins that you see on the bottom shelf in these pictures. So each level is a different color bin, and there's no order to the books that are in there except for that level 1 readers go one spot, level 2 readers go one spot, and level 3 readers go one spot. And because publishers have a very different system of how they level things, that's something that I level myself as the youth librarian, and I create a sticker that says what level I think it should be so that it makes sense to the children who are reading it, and it does not necessarily follow the level on the publisher's guidelines. So if you're wondering if you should make this change, there's different pros and cons. The pros to making this change is the ease of use. It's way easier for your patrons to use your library that way. And it often makes them happy. It increases their circulation, and it was a great opportunity to clean up catalog errors. And it makes your staff more familiar with the collection. The cons is that change is hard. It doesn't matter where you are or what you're doing. Anytime you make a major change to a system, it's going to freak somebody out. Staff and volunteers have to learn the new system. For us, our volunteers had a really easy time learning our changes, but our staff didn't always understand where things were or how to find them, so it took some extra staff retraining time. It can be a time-consuming process for the transition, and volunteers can potentially make the transition process more difficult. For me, when I started in the picture book collection, the first day the volunteer we had was amazing, and he was super fast, and we got through about 2/3 of the entire picture book collection in 4 hours the first afternoon, and I was so excited that he was coming back the next day. And the next day, even though we were doing the exact same thing, he put all the labels on wrong for every single book, and I had to go back afterward and take all of them off and clean off all the stickiness from the tape and reapply new labels, and it took forever. So definitely don't assume that your volunteers remember from one day to the next what the directions are or how to do it. It's totally worth taking 5 minutes to make sure you're on the same page every day with the volunteers before they start so that you don't have to go back and redo it. So this is a list of different resources that we used. It's got the link to the SlideShare from the Darien Library when they first made their change. It has information for Metis and other libraries that have made the changes, and we also have the complete by SAC subject heading list in case you wanted to look at that. So do we have any questions?
This is Jamie. So if you have a question for Jessica, feel free to type it in the question box, and I will go ahead and relay that to her. Jessica, I wanted to ask you just how the whole process went in the, not necessarily the transition, but how it has been going since the transition.
It has been wonderful for our library. It's made our patrons more comfortable in our space, so our books are going out more. Our circulation has gone up, I think, 30 or 35% in the past year. And we've been finding that children read a lot more in the library than they used to, so even if they aren't taking the materials home, they're using the materials in our spaces and will frequently come in and tell their peers where to find the books that they're looking for without needing to ask us for help at all, which is great that they've really taken some ownership in what that space looks like and how it works for them now.
Great. So I see some questions coming in, which is great. Sue asks, how do you promote to your patrons that this was a positive change?
We actually only had one person in 1.5 years tell us that they didn't like what we did. So we didn't have to struggle any with getting our patrons on board. And the one person who complained about it is a college librarian who already didn't like our system because it was different from how her school worked. Our patrons were just so excited to have a system that made more sense to them that we didn't really struggle with needing to get them on board. They were desperate to have a system that made more sense to them, and that's what this has been.
Okay, great. Erin asks, what do you do with books that cover more than one genre? Books on transportation and colors or counting?
That's a great question. What we did was Amanda and I would talk together And our number one question about any book, if we were trying to decide where to put it, was, if you were a patron, where would you look for this book? And if talking to each other didn't work well enough to give us that answer, we would ask patrons. So I had children who would come in for story time on a regular basis, and I would have them tell me, like, I see this book is a great book about colors. It also talks about feelings, and it has this other information in it. Where would you think to find this book? And they would tell me. And it was a really great resource to have those kids helping to figure out where they would think to look for something. Because that's really the purpose of having a library, is to make sure that we are serving our patrons the best way we can. And our cataloging system should be able to do that.
Great. Another question from Patty. Do you keep a 092 mark tag in mark record or use a 099 tag?
All of our records we pull from Library World, so we don't do a whole lot original cataloging on our own. We pull records from the Library of Congress system by scanning the barcode into our system whenever we get a new book. So some of our books have different tags than others based on whatever somebody else put into Library World before we bought the book. We're a very small library and we have a small collection, so we don't spend a ton of time doing original cataloging. And because of how our patrons are looking for information, as long as there is some summary information about what's in the book and it has an accurate title and author's name, it's going to come up in a catalog search, and that's the most important thing for us. So not super helpful on that one, I know, but that's how our community operates.
Okay. Another question from Erin. What about books with extremely thin spines? How do you get all of the information on the stickers?
So sometimes the sticker is a little bit too big for the spine, and that it just happens. We know how to shelve the books where they're supposed to be, and our patrons are fine with pulling the book off the shelf to get a closer look at the rest of the sticker. So with our very thin books, it's the same sticker, and it just rolls around the sides of the book more than it would on a book with a bigger spine. For the most part, it's not a huge issue because the tiniest books are the children's books and there's less information on those tags. So the color-coded single letter for P for picture book and then single letter for the first letter of the author's last name, those are vertically printed, so the P is above the author's last name initial, and it's rare that we have a book that would be on our shelf that is too thin to see a single letter on a sticker. And because we shelve them on the shelf by category, people are really looking for that color-coded sticker anyway, and then within the section are just browsing for whatever looks interesting to them. So we haven't had a ton of issues with that. As a general rule, we don't have a ton of paperback books for children because they fall apart very quickly, and all the hardcover books tend to have just a big enough spine that the sticker works. The only ones that that's not true for are the 8x8s for books like Berenstain Bears, and they just have a color and they're all together because it's part of the favorite section.
Great. We have another question, and this is from Joan, and she asks, when authors cover several genres, do you try to keep all of the books together or put them in the genres?
Because our patrons use our library so much as a browsable collection, we keep ours by genre, and that means that sometimes the books aren't together by the same author. But most of the time people aren't looking for books by a specific author no matter what the genre is. So that distinction works for us. For example, our Nora Roberts books are all together in the romance section, but the J.D. Robb books are in a completely different section because those are in the mystery section. We have very few patrons who will read both romance and mystery, so they don't care that they're written by the same person but are in different spots. And if we do have any patrons who want to read everything by a certain author, they tend to talk to us about it, and we help them find the other genres that those authors are writing in. So we haven't had any problems with that.
Great. So I want to know, Jessica, what are your plans for the future? Do you think you'll stick with this system for a while?
Definitely. Our patrons are really enjoying it, and we're finding it very easy to continue adding to our collection using these categories. So we plan to keep it for the foreseeable future.
And you mentioned that your library is quite small. So could this system work for a larger library, or how would adaptations maybe have to be made?
So I think it depends on the size of your library. The Meta system works very well with large collections because it's designed for a school library. So they have more categories, lots of subcategories, and it's designed to handle massive amounts of information. For us, we didn't need that much, so we tailored it down to be smaller. But that's why it's important to think about the needs of your community and the size of your collection and your space, and think about how you would adapt different things to work for your community. Anybody could make this change no matter what the size of your library is. You would just need to think about how your patrons are using your collection. BISAC, for example, could handle anything. Every book comes with a BISAC code because that's how publishers think about what they're making. So BISAC would be a great solution for a very large collection, especially that has a lot of nonfiction in it. The transition times and the expense are obviously a little bit different if you have a larger collection. Darien Public Library, for example, when they did their transition, they closed for 6 weeks to process all the books in their children's space. Yeah, nobody else could do that, but they were moving buildings, so they closed and moved to a new library, and in the process of doing that, relabeled all of their books.
Wow.
Their collection is like 15 times the size of ours, but it works for them. So it's all about how your patrons use your space, and if your patrons in particular are browsing a lot or are asking for books based on topics more so than authors, it is a really great solution.
Patty asks, did you keep the Dewey number on the book anywhere?
Yes. So we have the Dewey numbers on the original book labels. We didn't take them off. We did that on purpose in case our patrons revolted, so that we would be able to just remove the new labels that we put on and put it back if our patrons didn't like it. And thankfully, they loved it, so we have not had to do that. But we did keep the original Dewey numbers. It's helpful to us as staff so that we can find where every book in the library is supposed to be. So this was sort of our way of addressing a librarian's need to know the exact address of every material in our space, and our patrons need to have a system that they could understand and browse. So we use genre labels to indicate the sections for people to find materials based on that topic, but we do still have the original Dewey label on the book, and we filed them that way so that it makes sense for us to be able to find something.
Great. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions come in, and if you do have a question for Jessica that you think of after the program today, I'm sure she'd be happy to answer it for you. And as I mentioned earlier, the recording and Jessica's slides will be available on our website at the end of the day. Oh, and there is her contact information if you want to get that down. I do want to mention that our final webinar for spring is coming up on Wednesday, April 6th. It'll be at 1 p.m. And it's going to be on employee performance, and the title is Managing Employee Performance, or How to Boss Your Friends Around. So that should be a good one as well. So I want to thank all of you for listening in today. Thank you for your great questions, and I want to thank Jessica for a great presentation. I hope you have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week. So long.